I have spent years reading institutional documents, not for what they announce, not for the conclusions they state openly in the operative language that gets quoted in press releases and news summaries. I read them for the words that were chosen when the institution believed no one was paying close attention, for the adjectives selected under pressure, for the verbs that reveal, in a single syllable, what the official position actually is beneath the position being performed. I found one of those words in a federal court filing. The word was limiting. To understand why that word matters, you need to understand the sequence of events that produced the document it appeared in. In 2022, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives issued a classification letter declaring that force reset triggers, mechanical devices that use spring tension to accelerate the reset cycle of a semi-automatic firearm, constituted machine guns under the National Firearms Act and the Gun Control Act. The classification meant that manufacturing, transferring, or possessing an FRT was a federal felony carrying a potential 10-year sentence. Rare Breed Triggers, one of the primary manufacturers of these devices, had sold tens of thousands of units before the classification was issued. Those units retroactively became contraband. Rare Breed challenged the classification in federal court. The litigation ran for years through multiple jurisdictions. In 2024, the Supreme Court decided Garland versus Cargill, a case involving bump stocks, devices that use recoil energy to accelerate fire in a different mechanical way. The court ruled 6-3 that bump stocks do not convert semi-automatic rifles into machine guns under the statutory definition because the shooter's trigger finger must still initiate each shot individually. The majority's reasoning turned on the precise statutory language of the machine gun definition, a weapon that fires more than one shot by a single function of the trigger. The Cargill decision did not address force reset triggers directly, but it established the analytical framework, the strict text-based reading of the machine gun definition. The courts evaluating FRT classifications are now required to apply. In 2025, the ATF and Rare Breed Triggers reached a settlement agreement. The terms of that agreement, as entered into the court record, included language that the agency submitted under its own name, through its own counsel, in a formal legal proceeding. And in that submission, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives wrote that the agency has an interest in limiting the sale and distribution of force reset triggers. Limiting, not regulating, not ensuring compliance with applicable federal statutes, not monitoring the market for devices that may meet the statutory definition of a machine gun. Limiting, the sale and distribution of a product that, at the moment the settlement was being entered, had not been conclusively determined by a final court judgment to be illegal. I want to be precise about what institutional language does and does not reveal. Federal agencies do not submit language to courts carelessly. Every word in a formal legal filing has been reviewed by counsel. Every characterization of the agency's position has been vetted against the agency's litigation strategy, its regulatory posture, and its institutional interests. When an agency writes that it has an interest in limiting a product's distribution, it is not making an offhand remark. It is making a record. The distinction between limiting and regulating is not semantic. It is the difference between two fundamentally different institutional postures toward the same product. Regulation implies a framework, rules, compliance mechanisms, enforcement standards applied consistently to all actors in a defined category. Limitation implies a disposition toward reduction, toward less, toward a preferred outcome in which the thing being limited occupies less space in the world than it currently does. A federal agency that tells a court it wants to regulate force reset triggers is describing a relationship with the product. A federal agency that tells a court it wants to limit the sale and distribution of force reset triggers is describing a relationship with the product's existence. In the same document, the ATF included a reminder that the transfer or possession of a machine gun is illegal under federal law. The inclusion of that reminder in a settlement filing concerning a product whose legal classification was the subject of the resolved litigation is its own form of institutional communication. The agency did not need to include that statement to memorialize the terms of the settlement. It included it because it wanted the statement in the record, because it wanted a court document to contain, in proximity to references to force reset triggers, the federal prohibition on machine guns. I'm not concluding that this language proves a specific future enforcement posture. I'm documenting what the language says and what institutional documents say when agencies use particular words in particular contexts. The ATF's history with devices that accelerate fire rates follows a recognizable pattern. The bump stock classification was issued administratively, without congressional authorization, under the argument that the devices functionally converted semi-automatic weapons into machine guns, even if they did not meet the strict statutory definition. That argument was accepted by the agency, incorporated into a formal rule, and enforced against owners who had legally purchased the devices before the rule existed. The Supreme Court ultimately rejected it in Cargill. But between the rule's issuance in 2018 and the court's decision in 2024, the classification was operative federal law. Hundreds of thousands of devices were surrendered or destroyed. The FRT classification followed the same institutional logic. The agency identified a device. The agency determined that the device produced an effect, accelerated fire rate, that the agency believed the machine gun prohibition was designed to prevent. The agency then worked backward from the desired regulatory outcome to a statutory interpretation that would support it, and issued the classification. Cargill interrupted that process by insisting that the statutory text means what it says, that more than one shot by a single function of the trigger is the operative criterion, and that devices which require a separate trigger function for each shot, regardless of how quickly those functions occur, do not meet the definition. The ATF's submission in the rare breed settlement does not retreat from the agency's underlying position. It does not acknowledge that the FRT classification was incorrect. It records that the agency has an interest in limiting these products, while simultaneously placing the machine gun prohibition in the same document. If the political environment changes, if the administrative posture shifts, if new leadership arrives with different priorities, if Congress provides any arguable statutory hook, the agency has preserved, in the court record, a description of its institutional interest that is entirely consistent with renewed classification efforts. That is how agencies maintain positions that courts have made temporarily inconvenient. They do not abandon the position. They record it. They place it in documents that establish the agency's view for the next proceeding, the next administration, the next opportunity. The settlement resolves the immediate litigation. The language in the settlement preserves the institutional disposition for everything that comes after. I have watched this mechanism operate across multiple regulatory domains. The agency that loses a court battle does not change its view of the underlying policy question. It changes its litigation strategy. It waits for the composition of the reviewing court to shift. It waits for a statutory amendment that provides new authority. It waits for a factual development, a high-profile incident, a political moment that creates the conditions for a renewed regulatory push that the courts, in the changed environment, may be more willing to sustain. The bump stock rule was struck down in 2024 after 6 years of enforcement. During those 6 years, it was effective federal law. Owners who did not comply faced federal felony exposure. The rule's ultimate invalidity did not retroactively protect the people who surrendered their devices or faced prosecution during the period the rule was operative. The FRT classification operated on the same timeline. Rare breed has reached a settlement. Active enforcement actions related to the specific litigation have been resolved. But the tens of thousands of force reset triggers that were sold before the classification, that were seized during enforcement operations, that were surrendered by owners who could not afford to litigate, those devices and those enforcement actions exist in the historical record regardless of how the underlying legal question was ultimately resolved. Draft assessments from Second Amendment litigators following the post-settlement landscape suggest that the word limiting in the ATF's court filing has not gone unnoticed. The question being examined in legal and policy circles is whether the settlement represents a genuine resolution of the agency's position on FRTs, or whether it represents a tactical withdrawal that preserves the agency's stated interest for future assertion under more favorable conditions. The answer to that question is not in the settlement terms. It is in the language the agency chose to place beside those terms. Limiting, not regulating, not monitoring, not ensuring legal compliance, limiting the sale and distribution. And in the same document, unprompted, the reminder that machine gun possession is a federal felony. I have read enough institutional documents to recognize when an agency is closing a chapter and when it is bookmarking a page. This document does not read like a closed chapter. It reads like a record being preserved, like a position being maintained in a form that can be retrieved, like an institution that has accepted a temporary outcome while ensuring that the outcome does not become permanent by accident. The force reset trigger exists in a legal space that the Cargill decision defined but did not fully secure. The statutory text says what it says. The machine gun definition requires a single trigger function to produce multiple shots. FRTs, under the mechanical analysis that has prevailed in litigation, do not meet that definition. But statutory text is interpreted by agencies before it is reviewed by courts. And agencies that have recorded in formal legal proceedings that they have an interest in limiting a product's distribution are not agencies that have accepted the product's legality as a settled matter. If the current trajectory holds, according to early indicators from the post-settlement regulatory environment, the FRT question will return to federal court, not immediately, not through the same litigation that the settlement resolved, but through the mechanism that agencies have always used to preserve positions that courts have made temporarily unavailable, the accumulation of record, the patient maintenance of institutional interest, the wait for conditions that make the next attempt viable. I am not predicting when that attempt will come. I'm recording that the agency placed the word limiting in a court document, that it placed the machine gun prohibition beside it, that it did so with full knowledge of what institutional documents mean and what they are used for. History is made in those choices, not in the rulings that follow. In the word selected under pressure, when the institution believed the moment had passed and the record would not be closely read, I read the record. The moment has not passed.